Thank you for joining us. We are the Conflict Theory Group number 1. Resources are scarce. No wonder there's conflict. This presentation is done by Kimberly Stevens, Brittany Humphrey, Maurice Dean, and Talasha Theus. Conflict theory originated from Marx. It is based on power differentials, and it was generally thought of as a macro practice theory. Marx decided to investigate and came up with the theory that humans are more social creatures, and therefore they thrive with one another. Oftentimes, those who had conflict theory in their lives in the economic sector often had a false sense of consciousness, not realizing that their social class was where they were at. It wasn't so easily transferable between different classes. The theoretical principles for conflict theory is basically that conflict is inevitable. There is an unequal distribution of power amongst relationships, whether they're professional relationships or personal or in any part of someone's ecosystem. There is an ongoing struggle for scarce resources, which we as social workers know. We are constantly having to struggle and advocate and scrap for those resources for our clients. And the fourth theoretical principle is that whoever has the most power often controls the distribution of the resources, which is why we're in this industry. Get out there and advocate for our clients with the legislators and the lawmakers. So what does all this mean? Conflict theory with Marx was generally defined as the bourgeoisie were the owners of the factories and the private property. The middle class was who owned the power. They owned the means of production. They owned the private properties. Therefore, they were the ones who got to decide how the resources were distributed. The laborers, often known as the second-class citizens that had no power, were described as the proletariat. They were often the people that had nothing to sell but their labor. So resources are scarce. Conflict theory was often seen as being a part of a patriarchal society, whereas laborers and women and other oppressed and demarginalized populations were often thought of as second-class citizens. If an employer didn't want you standing up for your worker rights, employee rights, equal pay, they would simply cast you out and find someone else willing to do the job for a lesser wage. This was often a part of a caste system, which was kind of developed into an us versus them mentality. And it often brought about delusional thinking that if you worked harder, you could change your social class, which often wasn't true. Generally, the proletariat had two choices. They could either conform to the bourgeoisie or they could be part of the deviant. And if they were to conform, there were several different ways that they could. They could capitulate, which was just being doing what was asked just to find a place within a framework. A lot of times, if work was hard to find, a lot of times people would have to just conform in order to maintain employment. A lot of us have had experience with martyrs on the job. I give so much, but yet I'm so miserable. And then choosing a side doesn't always have to be verbal or written. Leaving a job often leaves that existing condition unchanged, just as remaining silent through oppression and unequal justices. Societal changes need to be heard and they need to be read. So not fighting the conflict is also a form of conformity. So on the deviant side, bend the rules, fight back, irritate management, find the whistleblowers. This is where organizers are found. And oftentimes I think of the migrant farm workers and Cesar Chavez basically speaking out and getting that grassroots movement going. So the application of conflict theory, the intervention can be both structural and cognitive. In order to integrate the structural intervention, you're working to reduce the unequal distribution of resources. This is working in policy changes, education, acknowledgement. In the in the cognitive application, a lot of times you need to help people see what their position is on the issue. They may think that, well, this doesn't involve me, so I don't want to get involved. But yet, again, choosing a side does not have to be verbal. Not choosing is still choosing. Here we have an example of conflict theory in a macro setting. Brittany has chosen to use community organizing for public transportation in rural areas. This demonstrates a lack of resource that ultimately results in conflict, and it attributes to the lack of amenities compared to more urban areas. How this affects the populations we work with could be people have to travel further for healthcare, employment, or education, which increases the chances of their basic needs not being met, and it also leads to an increase in social and economic injustices. So what can we do when it comes to transportation in rural areas? We can build coalitions that strive to influence and educate policy and funding, and that requires getting involved with those commissioners, senators, and government officials, the ones who make the policies and increase the funding or decrease the funding. It draws attention to those in power of conflict, and it also addresses the barriers and conflicts that affect the communities. Some of the limitations with this, however, are that it's difficult to evaluate the extent of the progress towards the goal, and it might not be measurable. Here we have an example from Maurice of conflict theory in a family therapy setting. It provides counseling for individuals, couples, and families. It addresses the power struggle within the context of those involved. Competing for resources and experiences is often what people are bringing to the table. It can lead to emotions being hurt and a lot of discomfort in having to address some pretty serious issues. Family dynamics and roles played by members affect the way the situations are handled. Require skill building to resolve conflict, and what that does is it teaches people how to handle change and hardship. Skills can be increased through role playing, letter writing, coaching, and communication. Some of the limitations with conflict theory in family therapy is that it might be seen as too political or extreme. And what comes to mind is that this has a cultural basis to it. A lot of times in certain cultures, things that are very personal within the family unit stay within the family unit. May emphasize on a person as a victim of structural inequality rather than being a capable participant in the process of change. Oftentimes, it can be criticized for failure to recognize the need for person-changing interventions and then to heal damage that's been done by social inequality. Talasha chose to use diverse client systems such as medical social workers in a hospital setting. I think we've all been dealing with clients who may have an oppressed situation such as uninsured, underinsured, trying to advocate for those people for the scarcity of resources. They include pre-admission planning, social and psychological assessments, discharge planning, and long-term care. Working with people in this area often include older adults, those with a mental illness or a mental diagnosis, children terminally ill, and like I mentioned, the uninsured or the underinsured. Some conflicting perspectives and recommendations from social workers are often compared to agency policies and then the people who pay the bills, Medicaid, Medicare, and the managed care providers. This can result in constraints due to lack of provisions. Some of the limitations with conflict theory in diverse client systems can often highlight the unequal balance of power which influences the relationships. This can include the propensity to view those who may be seen as medically unstable or oppressed as being victims and that who aren't capable of changing their own circumstances, when in case they very much could be capable of changing those circumstances with the right support and resources. So what can we do about conflict theory and those scarce resources? We need to organize, we need to lobby, and we need to advocate. This is why we're social workers. We need to get down to our state capitals. We need to talk to our representatives, our state senators. We need to stand up for the clients who need our assistance. So I'd like to thank you for participating and viewing our presentation. I look forward to reading and listening to some of your feedback and seeing what the rest of my cohort has brought to our learning table. Thanks so much.